From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Open Line.
Good evening, everyone. Thursday night, Rory Johnston here on Open Line on News Channel 5 Plus, sitting in the chair tonight as we tackle a kind of a current issue that you may have seen in the headlines regarding student loan debt. It is a big problem right now here in the United States, and you see there at the bottom of your screen, should student loan debt be canceled and what impact would that have? We're going to talk about the proposals being floated in Washington right now and also talk with an expert who we'll introduce in just a moment. A reminder, we call it Open Line because we open our phone lines and we want to hear from you. 737+ is our phone number. Now, our guest tonight, Whitney Barkley-Denney. She is a legislative policy counsel for the Center for Responsible Lending, and she's joining us via the wonders of the internet tonight from, I think you're in right outside the Raleigh-Durham area. Is that right, Whitney?
That's right.
Well, thanks for being with us. First of all, I'll ask you, what is the Center for Responsible Lending?
Yeah, so the Center for Responsible Lending is part of Self-Help Credit Union, which is one of the fastest growing credit unions and community development organizations in the country. So we work on policy, and particularly we work on policy that flattens and evens the financial playing field for middle-class families, people of color, working families, all of those folks who have kind of been shut out of financial systems in the past.
Sure. So whenever there is a new administration, as there is now in Washington, you know that there are going to be changes to those policies. And already we have heard the push here from some Democrats in the Senate, specifically Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, I know, and Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, I should say, pushing for student loan debt forgiveness. What were you anticipating this if Joe Biden were to become president and now the Democrats have control of the Senate?
We were. You know, we've really seen this conversation change and this narrative change over the last 5 years or so as people struggle more and more to deal with the student loan debt. And it's not just millennials, right? We're hearing from older people in particular who are going into their retirement years, still dealing with their children's student loan debt. So we saw this kind of wave coming over the last few years.
Right.
The initial proposals from the Biden campaign were for $10,000 in student loan cancellation, and we did some analysis of that. But the Schumer-Warren proposal, the bipartisan proposal and resolution that was introduced last week, is for $50,000 in student loan debt cancellation. That
is a lot of money, and there are arguments on both sides that we're going to discuss here over the next hour, and hopefully we'll hear from some folks out there because it seems like this, just like you said, it impacts so many people. You know, everyone knows someone who is out there still paying off their student debt. But how has the pandemic impacted this over the past year?
That's a great question, Rory. It's impacted it in ways that you would imagine, in that we see people with less income because of job loss or because of getting their hours cut. However, the Trump administration responded back in March with the original CARES Act by suspending payments on federal student loans through the end of the year. Initially, it was through October, then through the end of the year. And President Biden has extended that through September 31st. So it kind of gives us an opening to do some reform of student loan debt, whether it's cancellation or something else, before all of those borrowers start paying again. Even though I should note that that's only for federal student loans. So those borrowers who have private student loans are still paying.
And let's talk about that. When we just look at federal...
And I would say another issue that we've seen in the pandemic actually has to do with the PPP loans, the program participation loans for small businesses. We did an analysis earlier this year that was just released yesterday, actually, that found that 500,000 borrowers of color were shut out of that program because of student loan defaults. You couldn't get a PPP loan if you had a student loan default. So in some strange and unexpected ways, student loan debt was affecting people's ability to financially weather the pandemic.
That's really interesting to point out. As far as the federal level, federal loans, what are some of the numbers nationwide? How much debt are we talking about that you know, young people are coming out of college just overwhelmed?
Yeah. So we're talking about 44 million or so borrowers across the country. And again, these are who we think about, students who are just graduating. They're also their parents who may have signed what's called a Parent Plus loan, or even grandparents who may have signed that for them. We also see a large number of older Americans who went back to school during the last recession who are still dealing with those student loans. And overall, it's about $1.6 or $1.7 trillion that we're looking at in outstanding debt. I hedge on that a little bit because we don't really understand what the private loan market looks like. We know what the federal loan market looks like, but we don't know as much about what the private loan market looks like.
So from your perspective at the center there for responsible lending, what is the best step forward? Obviously, if you are struggling out there, anyone would welcome some help, whether it's $10,000 or $50,000. I think people would love some help. What going forward, what's the best way?
Well, I think, Rory, it's important to sort of step back and contextualize how we got here so we can talk about how we go forward. One of the reasons why student loan debt is so explosive is because the government actually used to really subsidize college education. You hear people saying, when I went to school, I worked at McDonald's during the summer and I paid for my tuition. Why can't people do that? A colleague of ours in Pennsylvania has looked at that, and it would actually take about 15 years of working a part-time minimum wage job to put yourself through school these days. And part of that, the largest part of that, is because the state and federal government has withdrawn aid to schools and increasingly relied on people taking out loans to go. The schools have made up that gap with tuition dollars funded by student loans. And so that's sort of how we got here. We really, really saw this dip in 2008 after that recession. And that's part of the reason why we support $50,000 in student loan debt cancellation across the board as a first step to getting back on track, really reinvigorating that government support for higher education and helping people move forward financially with their lives. So
you said it's a first step. How long would something like this take to implement? And then afterwards, what are the next steps?
Yeah, so it could be implemented really quickly with an executive order from President Biden telling the new Secretary of Education to wipe out certain portions of the student debt portfolio, or it could take a long time via reconciliation in the House and Senate or some other legislative maneuvering. But for next steps, we think there is a lot of reform that needs to happen. So a lot of borrowers are in what's called income-driven repayment, and those payments are still simply too expensive. They are forgiven after 20 to 25 years in that program, but then you have to pay income tax on that forgiven amount. So that's something that we would want to see fixed pretty quickly. Yeah, We'd like for parent borrowers to get all of the, I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say there is a lot of debate, as you mentioned, whether this could be done via executive order or reconciliation. And I know President Biden has talked about he would prefer something other than the $10,000, something larger be discussed and reconciled in Congress and not done through executive order. And critics have said no president has ever issued such a wide sweeping program via executive order. Do you see problems there?
Absolutely. I think, Rory, the truth is that we've never been in this type of hole before. As I said before, we used to have a lot more state and federal government support for borrowers as they were going about and trying to get their educations, whether it was through subsidies to the schools or direct subsidies to students that we don't have anymore. So we're in unprecedented times, and it calls for unprecedented action.
Sure. All right. Reminder, 737+ is the phone number if you would like to call in and join. Maybe you are one of those folks out there who are trying to repay that student loan. This past year, Whitney, these loans have been paused under the pandemic, correct? A lot of them? The payments?
That's right.
Right.
That's right, yes. Yeah, so they've been paused through September 31st of 2021.
So that has helped a bit. What would happen after that then? If no action is taken, would it be extended perhaps?
It's hard to say. And it's hard to say sort of where we're going to be in September of 2021, right? Are people going to be back to full employment and able to make those payments again? Or are folks just going to feel like they're still sort of being crushed underneath this weight? But if there isn't an extension and there's not any cancellation, then things would just go back to business as usual, and that money would be withdrawn from your bank account every month like it is like it was before March.
Before March, okay. All right, with that, we're going to take a quick break. We do have a couple of callers on hold. We'll be back with our guest and more Open Line right after this. Stay with us.